All right. All right. All right. All right. Welcome to the second edition of Lunch with Lincoln. I am Reed Galen, co-founder of the Lincoln Project. And thanks to everyone who tuned in last week to see Steve and me give you a little bit of how we see the world. And I am thrilled today to be joined by Matt Bennett, who is one of the co-founders of Third Way and their new project, Shield Pack, which we want to talk about a little bit today. So Matt, welcome to the show. So tell us a little bit about Third Way and what you guys do generally, and then what you want Shield Pack to be able to do during the 2022 midterm elections.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. We are huge fans of Lincoln, have been from the very beginning, as you know, when you were meeting in small conference rooms, and now you're a national phenomenon, so it's been exciting to watch. Third Way is my day job. It is a think tank and advocacy group that is center-left. We were formed, and I'm one of the founders. We founded it in 2005. And fundamentally, we're moderate Democrats, and we do policy development and political stuff around that. This year, we have decided for the first time in our history that we needed to do something more political, more like what you guys do, to try to overtly work in the process to help elect Democrats, because we are so alarmed by the prospect of Republicans getting power back in any way, but especially in the House. So Shield Pack is focused on helping to ensure that that doesn't happen, that we retain the Democratic majority in the House. Happy to talk more about it, but it's really focused on protecting incumbents from Republicans.
So you started Third Pack in 2005, or Third Way, excuse me, in 2005. So that would have been, right at the beginning of President George W. Bush's second term.
Right.
We would have seen there would be an impending Democratic wave in the 2006 elections. So from your perspective, what has changed since the time that you founded Third Way to now? And I know that answer could probably be an hour long, but are there any fundamentals that you feel like have been changed in the 16 years since you started?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I entered politics in 1987, working on the Dukakis campaign against George H.W. Bush. And from that time until about, near the end of the George W. Bush's administration, we were grappling with philosophical and policy differences between Democrats and Republicans, some of them very deep, many of them very passionately held, but never once in that period did I ever think that Republicans didn't love our country and didn't respect our fundamental democratic rules and norms. And as you know, and the reason that you founded Lincoln is that all of that just changed during this period since we founded Third Way. When we started again, we were battling ideas. We were in a struggle for over tax policy and climate change. And now we're fundamentally struggling over the question of who gets to vote and who gets to decide, and whether we live in a small d democratic country. So I am stunned by the amount of change that we've seen.
I mean, if you think about it, in 2007, I was working for Senator John McCain. And, that spring, I think that, he and then, late Senator Ted Kennedy were working on an immigration bill, right? A comprehensive immigration bill that I believe, as I recall, Matt, you can correct me if I'm wrong, had the support of President Bush.
Oh, yeah.
And ultimately, it didn't get done. And I don't think anything substantively has gotten done since then. And so I guess that's one thing you talked about. Somebody said, I think it was Stewart said that, on the 2004 Bush campaign against John Kerry, the big fight was over whether or not the top marginal tax rate was going to be 36.8% or 35%, right? And there were these huge fights over it, right? And what that meant for the country. And now what we see is that, look, we're not Democrats, but for lack of a better way to put it, that's, politically with whom we caucus, because as you said, the Republicans now, which, we burned our boats with those folks. And, I could speak for myself. And I think most of the guys, like, we're never going back. Right. Not that from our perspective, there's anything to go back to. But talk to me a little bit about what you've seen as far as how moderate Democrats are faring. I mean, it seems to me, just looking back to 2018, the last time the Democrats picked up a lot of seats and took the House, that it is those blue dog moderate Democrats that tend to serve as both the backbone of the caucus and the front line of the caucus during the elections.
No doubt about it. So the state of moderate Democrats is really mixed. On the one hand, to your point, we keep winning elections, right? We win the nomination for president, even when people think we won't, as in 2020. It looked really bad there for a while. It looked like Bernie was going to be the nominee. And then we ended up with Joe Biden, who is a self-professed moderate. To your point, in 2018, moderates dominated the primaries where they were running against far-left candidates. They lost only 1 or 2 in swing districts, and both of those, they lost 2 basically, one in my hometown of Syracuse, the other in Nebraska, and both of those farther left candidates lost winnable races in 2018. And by contrast, the moderates running in 2018 created the wave that gave the majority back to the Democrats. We keep seeing that happening. Terry McAuliffe, the moderate, just destroyed his opponents in the Virginia gubernatorial primary. He won every single county in Virginia. And so on the one hand, moderates are doing great. On the other, the loudest voices in our party are not moderates. They are the squad. They are Bernie Sanders. They're the people that the Republicans are able to kind of attach to the Democratic brand, and that's been really problematic.
Well, yeah, and so I guess that's the question is, I mean, and that's true now. Admittedly, when I say this, it's not a both sidesism. It's just more of an observation, which is on the Republican side of things. It has become a purely performative deal, right? There is no policy, there is no governance, and in fact, the louder, the crazier thing that you say, the more money you raise, the more attention you get. I think in some ways, people like Kevin McCarthy utilize those folks, although maybe he's just doing it by happenstance because I'm not sure he's smart enough to figure out how to do it on purpose, to sort of deflect attention away from, the maybe 5% less insidious things that he wants to get done. But give him cover because now he looks quote unquote normal. But let me ask you this. So let me fast forward to last year. The Dems had a pretty sizable majority going into the 2020 elections. And that shrunk. I think it's 5 or 6 seats now. So what do you think happened, in those 2 years? Was it just a ticket splitting thing? I don't want more Donald Trump, but I want to check on Joe Biden. What do you think happened last year?
There was a little of that. We actually just this week, along with 2 other groups, put out a massive retrospective on 2020. We don't call it a postmortem because nobody died. We have the majorities in both houses. We have the White House, but it's a really searching retrospective that's trying to answer that exact question, which is what did happen? I mean, there were serious headwinds for Republicans, and there was a lot of enthusiasm for Democrats. The polling turned out to be massively off, as we all know. So a lot of our expectations.
Well, we solved that problem, Matt, by here at the Lincoln Project by just not doing any.
Yeah, I think that maybe abolition may be the way to go here on polling. But yeah, I was talking yesterday to a House Chief of Staff, and her boss, the polling that they did in his district 3 days before the election was off by 10 points. And that was 3 days. I mean, it's insane. So one thing was expectations.
No, for the folks watching, missing by 10 points 3 days before an election is like trying to aim at the dartboard and throwing it out the front door of the bar.
Exactly. Yes, it is not just a miss. It is like you're in a completely different universe.
Right.
So the expectations were too high for Democrats. But that said, we lost a whole bunch of races that we didn't expect to lose, and not just because the polling was off. And if you look at the House races, and so our retrospective was a 6-month searching dive into that. We did 150 interviews. We looked at all the polling and turnout data. We looked at the ads. And fundamentally, we concluded a couple of things. One of them, and most important, I think, for this discussion, is that those attacks that Republicans were levying against the moderates who were running in these swing districts, calling them radicals, who wanted to defund the police, they were socialists. Depending on where you were, if you were in southern New Mexico or Oklahoma, it was you wanted to ban fracking. If you were in South Florida, you're a socialist. If you're in upstate New York, you wanted to fund the police. But all of those things were connected to things that the far left in the House caucus were saying and continue to say, and hold as principled points of view in good faith, but are very politically toxic in those places. And they didn't have anything to defend them. So we lost 14 House seats in
Right.
November. One was Colin Peterson, a senior member, but he had won a super Trumpy district in Minnesota. One was an open seat that we ended up losing by 6 votes. 6.
Right.
We lost 12 freshmen from the class of 18, and they were very good politicians, but they were just suffered this onslaught of lies about who they were, and they didn't have enough cover, and that's why we started Shield Pack.
All right, so I want to talk about Shield Pack in just a second, but that's one thing that we noted, and I think this is one thing for folks listening. Understand that, Matt talked about a race that came down to 6 votes. I mean, ultimately, guys, this is a game of small numbers, right? These races, the direction will be decided by the margin of the margin. And so what I think happened, at the national level, and it sounds like what you say, Matt, is it filtered down into the Senate and House races and probably into some state House races too, is that like Trump and the Republicans basically ran the Bernie Sanders playbook against Joe Biden because they thought they were going to get Sanders. Right. And it almost worked.
Did.
It almost worked. And I think you're right about it's not just not just South Florida, but the Rio Grande Valley in Texas.
Totally.
Where, and we were having a long discussion about this yesterday amongst some of our folks, which is, what does it look like in these places? And I think the other part too is just understanding that because you live in South Florida or because you live in the Rio Grande Valley and you might be Latino or Latina does not mean that, immigration is your number one issue, right? In fact, you could make an argument, and it's probably an unpopular argument, that if you were a second or third generation Latino, you have done what the country generally asks, which is you have assimilated. You consider yourself American first. And that comes with all of the positives of being a proud American. And sometimes it comes with sort of the darker edges, which is I'm here, my family's here, we've established ourselves, just like we saw in the early 1900s, right? My family were Russian Jews, right? People in New York didn't want more Russian Jews in New York. And so, but I think those are honest conversations that everybody has to have, as opposed to saying we can't possibly believe that there are gradations among different communities that we should probably take a look at.
Yes. And one of the other big things we found in this retrospective was that Democrats have made a huge mistake in dealing with voters of color, African Americans, Latinos, and Asian and Pacific Islanders as monoliths who all care about the same thing. If you're Latino, you care about immigration. If you're African American, you only care about crime. That's just wrong. And moreover, there's a huge degree of difference among these Latinos, depending on how long they've been here, where they are on the income scale, and where their families originally came from. So we have to start thinking about those voters as persuasion voters, not just base voters that need to be turned out on election day. And to your point about nativism, my dad actually wrote a book about, he's a historian, he wrote a book about nativism through the ages in America, and it goes way back to before the founding. And it always goes kind of cyclically. And what happens is that when a group of immigrants is here for a long time and they're into their second, third, and fourth generations, often they become nativists. That's what happened with a bunch of Trump supporters whose great-grandparents were called terrible things when they arrived in Ireland or Italy or other places.
So tell me about Shield Pack. Do you guys have some specific districts that you're looking at, some specific members? And then and then I'll ask a more probably tougher question, which is, how do you see redistricting affecting efforts? Because I know that given the delay in the census, a lot of the redistricting and frankly gerrymandering won't occur till later in the year. So how do you, first, who are you looking at?
Well, those two things are exactly related. We don't really know yet. We can be fairly confident that Jared Golden in Maine is going to have a tough race because there's 2 districts in Maine, and it's not going to change by much. And Cindy Axne, who won by a very narrow margin in Iowa, where next door we lost 2 races by agonizingly close margins, Abby Finkenauer and the open race we talked about. So that's going to be a tough race. They have independent, they don't have gerrymandering. They have an independent commission that does it. They have rules about what counties have to be in the district. So her district will probably remain the same. There's a few of those. But for the most part, we don't have the faintest idea. So Lauren Underwood in Illinois, a brilliant African-American member of Congress, her district is 3% Black, which is the lowest, I believe, ever for a member of the CBC. That's a really tough district, but Democrats control the means of redistricting there, and her district might get better, in which case she won't need much help, or might get worse, in which case she would need a lot. So we just don't know yet. What we do know, though, is McCarthy and the NRCC are already super clear about this. They are going to whack the moderates in exactly the way they did it in 2020 because it worked. And so ultimately we will need to defend them, but we probably won't know until January or February who it is.
Yeah, and that's, one thing that we're worried about, and I'm sure you are as well, and anybody who's worried about, not only if you're a Democratic, voter or member of the Democratic class, redistricting, gerrymandering, Republicans have made it an art. Texas picked up 2 seats. Florida picked up a seat. Those are places that do not have independent commissions, right? The legislature in Texas is, notorious, infamous even. You think back to 2003 when Tom DeLay did a mid-cycle redistricting just to do it. So,
and the Democrats tried to flee then too, the way they've done recently to avoid.
Yeah, well, the first time they fled to Ardmore, Oklahoma, and then the next time was New Mexico or vice versa. It's a unique thing in Texas that there's enough Democrats to prevent a quorum, and look, that's the other thing too, right? I mean, they're fighters down there. We're gonna need a lot of fighting Democrats, right? You talk about the ideas that there are some things that are underpinned by policy, but at the same time, like when you talk about immigration is not a policy issue anymore. It's a cultural issue. Socialism is not a political issue. It's a cultural issue. Defund the police is not a political issue. It's a cultural issue. But what the Republicans have been good at, even since the time when I still worked there, was taking cultural issues and making sure, or trying to make sure, they have electoral outcomes. And because, we had a bunch of Republicans and independents cross the line in 2018, in House and Senate races. We had the same at the national level last year. We've got to find out how to, bring those people or keep those people on side for the next 18 months. And, it's not the easiest thing to do. Say we need to save democracy is a great thing. We can write lots of op-eds on it. Talking to a specific voter about it, when they've got everything else going on, can sometimes be harder. So, Matt, I want to take, we got a couple of questions here. Let's see. All right, so this is a good one. What can we do to convince Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema to join in abolishing the filibuster, given McConnell's statement that the era of bipartisanship is dead? So, all right, so Matt, I'm gonna turn the tables on you. So Sinema and Manchin consider themselves, I think, to be moderate Democrats, but now it seems that they are utilizing that as a way to stop voting rights from happening, or voting rights from being brought to the floor for a true vote. They don't want to abolish the filibuster. So how do we account for moderates who we think should go our way but don't?
Well, look, I think that Manchin and Sinema on this question, particularly as it relates to H.R. 1, the voting rights bill, are outliers. I know that they don't speak for most moderates in the Senate, like Chris Coons and Michael Bennett and Jeanne Shaheen. Right. And they certainly don't speak for Third Way. We believe that this is worth killing or wounding the filibuster over, because it's so important, because our democracy is teetering on the edge of the abyss. So I can't speak for them because I think they're wrong. I will say that those who say Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden should just put more pressure on Joe Manchin don't have the faintest idea how things work in the U.S. Senate. There is no more pressure that can be brought to bear. Like, this is just not how it works. The arm twisting days of Lyndon Johnson are gone, and that isn't going to work with Joe Manchin. So I think the odds of something like H.R. 1 passing in this Congress are close to zero. But I do think it is conceivable, at least, that something like the John Lewis bill, which would basically restore the proper role of the Justice Department in overseeing the kind of blatantly racist and illegal shenanigans that we're seeing in places like Texas and Georgia, giving the power back to the Justice Department, that is conceivably something that Manchin and Sinema could get behind. I don't know how they would justify, changing the filibuster doing it, because I don't think there's 10 Republicans for that. But that seems to me much more likely than H.R. 1, a bill that should pass that at the moment looks pretty bad.
So yeah, I mean, and so the John Lewis Act, I think, is H.R. 1, if I'm not mistaken. But and just for everybody there, so in 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the sort of main provisions of the 65 Voting Rights Act. I think the most important one of which, excuse me, was what was called was a pre-clearance, I think is what it was called, which is, there were a certain number of states, typically most of them in the South, most of them in the former Confederacy, where if they were going to change voting rules, that the Justice Department basically had to sign off on it ahead of time because of the history of disenfranchisement and making it harder for people to vote. They struck that down. And now, of course, we've seen in the last 5 months, this flurry. I mean, we've seen it's been on the march, since then. But certainly this spring and early summer, we've seen just this flurry of anti-voting rules and regulations and legislation going through state houses. All right, let me see. We've got another one here. M. Griff on YouTube, Matt, asks, when are the conspirators of 1/6, I assume January 6th, going to be dealt with? And not just the people who stormed the Capitol, but in your mind, both the politicians and the Trump appointees. You live in D.C. or inside the Beltway anyway. What's your sense? Is there accountability for those folks, or is this one more thing where Washington just wants it to go away and wants to move on with life?
I dearly hope that there is accountability, that it is the worst assault on our democracy since the Battle of Gettysburg, and we should be dealing with it. But I'm not sure there will be. I know there is deep reluctance in the Justice Department to go after former officials on pretty much anything, because they don't like setting precedents by which, when the parties change, there is criminal sanction brought against their predecessors, even when it's deserved. It's here. I'm not saying that nothing will happen. Even if there's not a bipartisan commission, which it appears there won't be, given Republican intransigence on that. I think there will be a lot of congressional oversight hearings, and at the moment, Democrats have subpoena power, and they can hold folks accountable, at least in the court of public opinion, if not in actual court. But unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see former officials being marched off to jail for their role in this treasonous activity that happened on January 6th, and that they continue to foment. And the one thing I'll say about that, though, is, and there's been news about this today, is the incitement of violence against election officials. If that leads to actual violence, then that could lead to some sort of legal sanction for the people responsible.
Well, I mean, I would say this is that, one, yes, I mean, January 6th opened up political violence, and it re-entered it into the American lexicon for the first time probably since the late 60s, the late 1960s. And so there will be more violence. But I guess my other point, too, is, I've been thinking about this a lot this week, is this idea of how many things throughout human history have been allowed to happen because people were afraid of an unknown alternative or an assumed alternative.
Yeah.
Right. And so, well, the Justice Department doesn't want to set this precedent because they don't want to have, something else happen down the line. Well, if you don't want to have something else happen down the line, then take care of the problem now. Right. Mm-hmm. Like assuming that if we do nothing. And so what I think happens is this fear of doing something that may have a bad outcome becomes, first a fear, then an excuse, then the reason, right? Well, we can't do it because X will happen. And I think we've seen that throughout history just really work out badly. All right, let's see. All right, Matt, here's one from Life Hacks on YouTube. Can the Democrats create a, quote, gun-toting Democrats program to support a crossover of some Republicans who only support the party for the Second Amendment?
Yes, we absolutely can. In fact, before we founded Third Way, the four of us who founded it were working at a group called Americans for Gun Safety. And our fundamental premise was that we should accept that the Second Amendment offers an individual right to own a gun, as the Heller decision later determined it does. and arguing over it was stupid because there's 400 million or more guns in private hands in the United States, and we're not getting them back. Nobody's going door to door to get those guns back. So why would we have that discussion? And I think what you've seen is the Democratic Party, while it's moved kind of to the left on a lot of other social issues, it hasn't so much moved to the right on guns as accepted fundamentally the premise that there is a right to own a gun, but that rights come with responsibilities.
Right.
We won't get hardcore, NRA supporters to support Democrats. I think if you're a single issue voter on guns, you're probably lost to Democrats. But I do think for the vast majority of gun owners who are not members of the NRA, and most are not, then that kind of approach can be attractive.
All right. So Matt Carroll on Facebook asks, how can we use what happened on January 6th against the Republicans in the midterm? So for, you've got Shield Pack, at Shield Pack on Twitter, I believe, and we can put it up on the screen here. So we have a fundamental belief at the Lincoln Project that we must keep the events of January 6th front and center in the minds of American voters and not let Republicans off the hook for it, because that's they know it's bad for them. They know it's bad for the country, and they know that what people saw on that day shocked, the soul, I think, of our country. So how do you, as someone who's going to be going out and defending moderate Democrats, how do you see the events of January 6th in the context of a campaign?
Well, look, I think every successful campaign has to have both offense and defense. And Lincoln Project and the DCCC and House Majority PAC and other groups are principally going to be doing offense. It's what you guys did in the last cycle so brilliantly. And I think that's what you'll be doing again is as you say, keeping January 6th alive and fresh in the minds of voters is very, very important, particularly in the face of this unbelievable gaslighting that they're doing about how it was just a normal tourist visit to the Capitol and how it was really Antifa and all this other slew of lies that they've been starting to tell about January 6th. It's very important that all of us continue to do that. Shield Pack, though, is going to stay in our lane. And our lane is going to be defending incumbent Democrats in swing districts from these specific set of lies about them, that they're socialists or they want to defund the police or what have you. But we're going to be very strongly supporting groups like Lincoln that are doing the offense while we do the defense.
So Matt, just on that a little bit, Republicans use the American flag. They use patriotism as a cudgel. Some of them actually used it as a literal cudgel on the steps of the Capitol in January. Why are Democrats afraid of patriotism?
I don't think we are. I think that's a lesson that you learned earlier in your career back when you were a Republican, and there was a real question about whether Democrats could accept flag waving patriotism. And when I entered politics in the 80s, we were still feeling the echoes of Vietnam and the counterculture movement. And it was tough for Democrats to, wear lapel pins with a flag and have a lot of flag kind of waving both metaphorically and actually at our events. But I do think that that's changed. If you looked at the convention in 2016, the last time we had a normal Democratic convention, there was a pretty serious embrace of patriotism and the flag. We had a lot of military folks speaking. There was a lot of USA chants going on. So I think that has evolved over time. It is still kind of stuck in the minds of a lot of voters that Republicans are more patriotic. Obviously, the current Republican Party is deeply unpatriotic. I mean, if you hit cops with flags, you are unpatriotic by definition. If you storm the Capitol, you don't love our country. So I'm hoping that that'll change.
So Matt, in our last minute here, where can folks get more information on you, on Third Way, and on Shield Pack?
Thirdway.org, shieldpack.org are the best places to go, and we would love people's thoughts, any support you can give us, and very much appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about it.
No, thanks, Matt. Thanks for joining me. And for everybody out there, remember that Lincoln Project podcast, hosted by yours truly, drops on Tuesdays and Thursdays. You can find it on your favorite podcast app. And also, don't forget to tune in Tuesday and Thursday nights, 8 p.m. Eastern, for Lincoln Project Television, The Breakdown with Tara Setmayer and Rick Wilson, and on Wednesday nights at 8 p.m. for We're Speaking with Lisa Senecal and Maya May. Until next Friday, thanks everybody for listening. And Matt, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.